Welcome to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM for Friday, December 6th. I'm Andrew Walworth, and I'm joined by RCP President and co-founder Tom Bevan, and sitting in for Carl Cannon, Emily Jashinsky. She is Washington correspondent for UnHerd and host of the YouTube series Undercurrents. So the assassination of healthcare executive Brian Thompson this week shocked the country. He was gunned down outside of his hotel in New York City, and the reaction to this brutal attack has been surprising, at least to some of us. Tom, the Philadelphia Inquirer columnist Will Bunch wrote, "In a nation ruled by its oligarchs, the oligarchs become targets for assassination." And he goes on to say, in a weird way, this, and he's talking about the murder, is a reality check. So what do you make of the fact that, some people are reacting to this horrific event by seeming to try to rationalize it, if not to outright justify it? Seems odd to me.
Yeah, there was also a professor, Anthony Zenkis, who tweeted like moments after it happened, really. This is back on the 4th of December. It says, "Today we mourn the death of UnitedHealthCare CEO Brian Thompson, gunned down. Wait, I'm sorry. Today we mourn the deaths of 68,000 Americans who needlessly die each year so that insurance company execs like Brian Thompson can become multimillionaires." And his comment section was flooded with folks that, were telling him that was bad form and despicable. And he defended it over and over and over and over again. And I think we do see that aspect. It's not a huge number of people, but it's enough people almost exclusively on the left who to be sort of disturbing, right? To not just recognize sort of the human tragedy of this executive, whatever you might think of his company, whatever you might think. This guy was a husband, he was a father. I think what's most shocking about it, one of the things is it's on tape. If we hadn't seen the tape, it wouldn't be as visceral to us watching someone walk up and, basically just a couple feet behind someone and shoot them and kill them. That's a traumatic thing to see. And obviously millions and millions of people have now seen that video. And so to not even sort of recognize that or have some sort of human reaction to that, to immediately go to, the bad healthcare companies and corporate executives, and they all deserve death. And Taylor Lorenz of the Washington Post has just been, she's been one of the worst offenders here. And she's not some insignificant, troll on Twitter with 100 followers. She's a big time name in the journalism industry. And she's been one of the worst offenders.
Emily, what do you make of it? And were you surprised? I got to say, I've been sort of appalled by the reaction. This is as Tom said, this is a tragic event. This is a guy, father, gunned down, shot in the back. But you sort of get the feeling that people are looking at his murder almost as a folk hero or something.
They also don't know why this happened yet. So it's especially, I think it's especially problematic from that perspective, because one of the things that we know about the private healthcare industry is that it's deeply entangled with the government. And I don't know what happened. I don't know what the exact motive was. But the idea that this is necessarily, some sort of Robin Hood act, a dark Robin Hood act, and it took out somebody who was deeply corrupt and, killing people on their own, et cetera, as we've heard a bit. It's also short-sighted. It lacks nuance and it's stupid. We could get to like the moral part that Tom just covered perfectly, but it's also stupid. Right. They don't really know what happened. There could have been a lot of different things that happened. And it's a reminder also that people who work in these industries, if you talk to reporters who've covered corruption for a really long time, they will tell you just about everybody thinks that they're doing the right thing. You get your like Martin Shkreli's, but actually what's much more in a way difficult about rooting out corruption is that everyone sort of thinks that they are doing the right thing, that they are, it might be because they've been paid very well for a long time to believe that, or it might be because they're ideologically they believe that, and that's a problem if you happen to be on the other side of the debate. But most of these people think they're doing good. They're not necessarily categorically bad people. And I think that's also sort of sad that we miss that nuance, because it actually makes it harder to deal with the problem.
Yeah. Emily, I'm just wondering, and I often point out when you're on the show that you're a recovering culture critic, that is this in part driven, though, by online, what journalism has become so online, and that people sort of feel that they can say things online. Mainstream writers can say things on Twitter or X or wherever that they can't say in their publication themselves. They're sort of hot takes. And without reflection, when you read them, they sort of are shocking, at least to me.
It's also because we have social media at our fingertips, we feel like we have to say things to fill the silence. If something major happens, journalists go right to posting, which is a form of publishing. If you're posting on a platform you're using for journalism, it's a form of commentary. It's a form of journalistic, professional commentary, even if it's not being printed on the pages of your outlet, which some of it ultimately is. Even the dumb ideas then make their way into the outlet because they've already been kind of tested out on X. So I think part of it is that everyone wants to have something to say when something dramatic happens, and we're gamifying the discourse. So what you have to say, you have incentive to make it outrageous. You have incentive to make it a little wild, because that's how you're going to get engagements, how you're going to get likes and retweets. And we're just like programmed to enjoy getting likes and retweets. Some people even like getting the negative comments. So I think part of it is that these social media platforms have algorithmically like totally gamified the way that we talk about life and death, literally. And it's very, very unhealthy.
Tom, what do you think?
I definitely think social media has added an element to it, but look, this is how our system has been set up. Emily's been on TV, I've been on TV, on panels and whatnot, and my least favorite situation that I'm in is when a big event happens and you're live on air and they ask you to react to it immediately when you literally know very little about the circumstances, any of the context, but cable news is 24/7. They got to fill the space. It's a big event. Something happened. This guy got gunned down. And so people need to comment about it, even if they don't have literally any or very little idea of what actually happened. I mean, here we are, days later, and we still, to Emily's point, the gunman's still at large. We have a couple of clues from the, words that were written on the bullet, but we don't know who this person is, what their motive was. Were they, coming from a left-leaning perspective, a right-leaning perspective? Were they mad about the company? Was it something personal about the guy? I mean, we just don't know. But that does not stop our media industrial complex from having to fill that time. And as I said, social media definitely, sort of as it does with everything else, is sort of an accelerator, if you will, of that bad habit and tough situation that we often find ourselves in.
Yeah, and it's not, when you look at this, it's not just aimed at him as being part of the healthcare industry, but it's also this sort of this oligarch narrative that's part of it. This Maureen Chasik, she's the investigations editor at the American Prospect. She wrote, only about 50 million customers of America's reigning medical monopoly might have a motive to exact revenge. But she goes on to say Thompson's death at 50 was, quote, a lot more tragic when you know that his life expectancy as a member of the top 1% was 88, or 15 years longer than the life expectancy of the average American male. Is this going to sort of accelerate, Emily, under Trump? Do you think this sort of anti-oligarch aspect where billionaires, millionaires are sort of seen as being the real enemy, and acts like this, like I say, if they're not being justified, they're being sort of explained away?
That's interesting, because I think it gets to how this version of the hashtag resistance will look. And it does seem like Democrats, the Democratic Party establishment, is realizing they may have to sincerely adopt some of the class-based populism that Obama had a kind of love-hate relationship with in the Tea Party years, but you guys both remember during the Tea Party years here in Washington, D.C., if you went to like a conservative banquet, there would be Occupy protesters, banging on limousines and throwing paint on people wearing tuxedos or whatever it was.
Yeah, the good old days of class warfare. I remember that.
Yeah, it was such a simpler time. But it's interesting because those right-wing events would be, maybe they would have some tangential relationship to the Koch brothers or whatever, and the right was very defensive of entrepreneurship and people who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and made money. And now Donald Trump is a billionaire, like head of the Republican Party. But at the same time, there's this like class-based populism on both the left and the right. Trump seems to be answering it though, by bringing in people like David Sachs, people like Elon Musk, obvious example, Vivek Ramaswamy, obvious example. He went with Bessent over Lutnick, or the Lutnick also got Commerce. So he's sort of surrounding himself with like titans of industry. And I'm really curious. I think it's an open question as to how that sort of colors class-based populism on the right.
What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I just saw a story, I think today, someone had gone through and added up the wealth of all of Trump's potential, nominees. And it was something like $370 billion or something. It was, that he is establishing or surrounding himself. It's the new oligarchy now. Will that be a criticism that will be effective against Trump and the Trump administration moving forward? It depends on what they do, right? It depends on how they conduct themselves and whether they're actually, putting forth policies that are helping the upper, the top 1%, or whether they're actually working to help increase the living standard for working class voters, which is, what they say they're going to do. And that's part of the MAGA, populist movement. So, but again, the proof will be in the pudding, and we'll see if they don't do that, that leaves them vulnerable to this idea that, Trump's a billionaire and he's surrounded himself with a bunch of rich buddies and they're just looking out for themselves. And that might have some purchase with voters, but, we'll have to see what they actually do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be back in a moment. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm talking with Emily Jashinsky and Tom Bevan. Don't go away. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Emily Jashinsky and Tom Bevan. And Tom, the Washington Post had a piece with the headline, "Trump could hobble renewed fight against domestic terrorism, analysts warn." They go on to say, based on his first-term record, researchers expect the next Trump administration to shift the government's focus from white supremacists and other far-right militants. Among the predictions, a slashing of domestic terrorism resources, White House pressure to investigate what Trump terms the radical left, and cuts to programs aimed at the prevention of radicalization. So, Tom, what do you make of the story, and what do you make of the accusation?
Well, you did not read the most offensive.
I was going to leave that for you.
Story, which is like, I think it's like the third or fourth graph in the story, which says, and I quote, "Trump and several of his picks for senior posts have espoused ideologies the Biden counter-extremism project was designed to combat, including white supremacist replacement theory, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia." So apparently Jeff Bezos' effort to make the Washington Post less partisan and more objective is going swimmingly. I joke. Look, this is outrageous. I mean, it's just a ridiculously biased story. And there's no question that when Biden came into office, he instructed his Justice Department. If you remember, he instructed the Defense Department. They took an entire day where all they did was like, was it a day? I think they shut down the department or something, right? And because they were trying to root out, white supremacy within the Defense Department, extremism, and this focus turned from actual terrorists to, basically Americans who disagreed with them politically and could be painted as extremists. And that included, by the way, little old ladies standing outside of abortion clinics. I mean, and Catholics, Catholic parents. And so it's just been this absurd narrative, in my opinion, that's gone on for a number of years. And yes, it will change under the Trump administration, and that's a good thing. That I think they'll actually get focused on real threats. And I'm not saying there's not white supremacism and there's not racism and there's not Islamophobia in the country. There will always be, but it is a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. And doesn't, there are plenty of other more real and substantial threats that demand the attention of our government. And most of them are not domestic, they're overseas.
So, Emily, what do you make of that? And do you think it's a fair criticism, though, that they will sort of shift their attention away from white supremacist groups or whatever to more foreign-based threats? Because Trump, when he lays out his anti-terrorism plan, which he did a couple weeks ago, it was focusing sort of on overseas threats. He didn't make much of a mention of domestic terrorist threats that would come from the right.
Yeah, I mean, they just appointed actually Tiffany Trump's father-in-law to be the sort of envoy for Middle East and Arab affairs. And what's interesting about that is he was doing their outreach to people in Michigan. And that was, specifically trying to bridge the Trump administration and protesters over Gaza, people in Dearborn who were voting on the issue of Israel and Gaza. And I say that because we've seen a lot of signaling from incoming people like Pam Bondi. I think Pete Hegseth would fall into this category about cracking down on anti-Israel protests as a form of domestic extremism. So I think that's, what was sort of, I don't know if amusing is the right word, but worthwhile about thinking through is how these weapons that the left has built up over the course of the Trump administration to surveil quote unquote domestic extremism when it comes to white nationalism, quote unquote white nationalism, Christian nationalism, white supremacy, could then be turned in a very dramatic fashion on them when the Trump administration steps in.
Well, what about, and Emily, I wanted to ask you about the press because, Kash Patel, who may end up running the FBI, has said some provocative things about the media, including this. He said, we will go out and find the conspirators, not just the government, but in the media. Yes, we're going to come after people in the media who lied about American citizens, who helped Joe Biden rig presidential elections. We're going to come after you, whether it's criminally or civilly. We'll figure that out. But yeah, we're putting you on notice. That's caused people not just on the left, but to wonder how they view First Amendment rights, which are kind of important around RealClearPolitics, and I'm sure around UnHerd as well.
It was interesting over the course of the Trump administration to talk to conservatives in DC about some of these like novel and innovative paths to restoring America they were thinking of, and getting rid of like the New York Times v. Sullivan standard for defamation was on that list. And I would always, say like, come on, guys, let's really think this through, because conservative media would be like first on the chopping block if you want to go there. And it's a good, there are some reasonable criticisms of that standard, but I actually do, like, as somebody in the media, as I'm sure both of you do, have concerns anytime people talk about like legally taking steps that would make our jobs harder. I think our jobs are already honestly hard enough, given that the government does. We were just talking about how the extent to which the government tries to control the flow of information. Elon Musk obviously owning X has changed that a little bit, but some of these major platforms that are used to do journalism are owned by billionaires. I would consider them oligarchs, and those oligarchs are becoming more and more Trump friendly. So I guess that's good to the free speech cause, not the like sort of the woman who's the head of NPR and was with Wikipedia at one point, talking about how truth is essentially overrated and all of that and blah blah blah. So I don't know exactly what it would look like. I think Kash Patel and his allies don't know exactly what it would look like, just because he said he's already saying he's not sure if it's criminal or civil. Like, these are not plans that anybody has landed on. They speak to appetites and inclinations that can manifest. Brendan Carr has talked about like making sure that people are using the public privilege of having a broadcast license and taking that seriously. And again, like, as long as that doesn't encroach on the First Amendment, I think we do not talk enough about how those licenses are given by the government. There was a purpose for them to be licensed, which was you need to serve the public good. So I'm all for, reminders, but taking legal steps to curtail free speech and journalistic inquiry obviously would be concerning. I just don't know if they're really dead serious about taking concrete action so much as using the rhetoric.
Yeah. Brendan Carr, of course, is nominated to be the head of the FCC. Tom, where do you come down on this?
Yeah, I mean, I it'll be interesting to see what they do and what they try and do. I'm with Emily on this one. I don't like to see that. And by the way, the media has done an incredibly effective job of, shredding their own reputations. I mean, and doing themselves harm. And so, which is why nobody trusts the media anymore anyway. So that in and of itself, I think let them speak and let them do what they have done for the past 7, 8, 10 years, maybe longer. They've discredited themselves. And particularly in this last election, we've seen the rise of alternative media and podcasts and other outlets that people are turning to. And so I'm not sure, what Kash Patel, what he thinks he would be able to do. He wants to throw people in jail for, writing stuff about the Russia hoax or say, the COVID lab leak theory, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what he'd be able to do civilly too. And again, I'm just not sure it would be that effective. If anything, it might produce a backlash that would make reporters in some of these organizations look sympathetic, as opposed to, what they're doing right now, which is just sort of disgracing themselves, and public opinion is reflecting that.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about Eric Adams for a second. He's the New York mayor. Interesting. He is set to meet with Donald Trump's border czar, Tom Holman, next week. New York is, Emily, of course, a sanctuary city, but it seems like the mayor there is taking a tack that's different, at least, than some of his Democratic peers in other cities. What do you make of this? And do you think he's taking a harder line on immigrants? He says he wants to do it, especially when it comes to those that commit violent crime.
Sounds just like Tom Holman. And, honestly, I'm loving this because it's just the results of the experiment becoming too clear to ignore. The experiment with sanctuary cities and lenient border and asylum policies becoming too clear to ignore for even a Democrat mayor, a Democratic major city mayor like Eric Adams. And it is too hard to ignore if you're in New York. Like, there are people on the left in New York, the left in New York, who've now come to recognize the folly of having some of these policies. So Eric Adams is an interesting case study because, on the other hand, he also is looking for an avenue to make himself seem like an outsider, like he's challenging the Democratic Party, like he's going after the establishment, because he understands, to the extent he can cast himself as an outsider, he can say he's being targeted by the Department of Justice in his case about foreign ties to Turkey and improper foreign ties to Turkey and all of that. So I'm not sure, what's motivating it is like sincere and pure, but he's like, the political winds are blowing in a way that it's obvious, and it does reflect on the substance of the problem.
Yeah. Tom, we got about a minute left here. You're out there in Sanctuary City, Chicago.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I mean, it's a real issue. And back to Eric Adams, though, I mean, to Emily's point, I saw someone on Twitter say, "Man, he's working really hard for a pardon from Trump," which
right.
Again speaks to motive. But he said, listen, and you've seen his evolution on this, and where he said, "Look, you can cancel me all you want. I don't even care. I got to protect the people of New York City." I think it has gotten to the point where, past the tipping point, where even Democrats who live in the city recognize that it's a problem and it needs to be fixed. Certainly that is the case here in Chicago. And by the way, mostly I would say, I mean, it's across the political spectrum, but a lot of African Americans on the south side of Chicago and Hispanic Americans on the west side of Chicago see that their hotels are being taken up, their schools were being used, their playgrounds, and all of this money, which could be coming to help them with social services, are going to fund these shelters and welfare and all of this stuff for these folks who are here illegally. And that's one of the reasons that I think Trump was as successful as he was in November. And so it doesn't surprise me that Eric Adams is doing this, and maybe we'll see some other mayors follow suit.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. We'll check in next week on that meeting, see if we can get some reporting on what was said. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I've been talking with Emily Jashinsky and Tom Bevan. We're going to take a break and be back right after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined now by Richard Porter. He is a former committeeman from the state of Illinois, Republican committeeman, and a lawyer and a contributor to Real Clear Politics. Richard, great to have you back.
It's good to be here, Tom.
Okay, so one of the reasons I want to talk to you, you had a piece that we ran on the site this morning talking about DOGE, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, that's going to be headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. They were on Capitol Hill yesterday, sort of making the pitch to folks there. Give our listeners a sense of your argument. It's a legal argument. It's a specific argument about how they should attack this. Set this up for our listeners.
Sure. I mean, the thing to recognize is that the legal structure of how the executive branch operates is designed to be deliberative. It takes time. Actions the executive takes cannot be arbitrary and capricious. They have to be reasoned. And their actions, their regulatory actions, whether it's writing a regulation or deleting a regulation, has to be explained, and the courts will review the explanation to make sure that it's reasoned as opposed to arbitrary and capricious. This is the structure by which the executive branch has been constrained to make sure that it operates in a way that is, it can be anticipated by the people, and people have a role with the notice and comment procedure and the timing and so forth. So it's designed to go slowly and deliberatively. Unfortunately, that's not really conducive to a restructuring. Restructurings that take a long time never happen. And right now we have a political moment where there's a lot of eagerness around the restructuring of the government, a lot of passion, the belief the government is just way too big. And I think that's part of what captured the public's imagination with the election of Donald Trump. And so what we need to do is, in order to enable that to occur, in order to empower the president to take the actions necessary to restructure how the government works, we need to cut some of those strings, those legal strings that are designed to constrain the executive's actions, and empower him instead to take some of these actions in a more swift and efficient manner.
And what is that going to look like? I mean, how would that? I mean, is this needs to be done through Congress? Is that the argument that
Yeah.
Any executive order that Trump issues, it'll be challenged in the courts, which, as you mentioned, half the federal judiciary is appointed by Democrats and probably wouldn't look favorably upon some of those actions. And B, couldn't those also be undone by the next president if a Democrat wins 4 years from now or 8 years from now?
Right. I mean, look, there's actually only a limited scope of action the president can take without changing the law. And the law, you could actually design a whole proposal of what you want to do, and you could take it back to Congress, and you could debate every detail of what that proposal would look like, and then Congress could vote for it. You'd need to get up to 60 votes in the Senate to get something like that through. It's just very unlikely that any kind of major change in the government is going to work its way through Congress in the usual way. And so what I'm proposing is instead empowering the president with essentially a blank check, and say to the president he has a time-limited power to reorganize the government without complying with, basically suspending the rules that limit the president's power to act with impunity, just to get things done, right? As opposed to issuing regulations and then waiting 90 days for comments and responding to the comments and then going to the courts and all that sort of thing. To wipe that slate clean, give the president the power to act. And I think one of the protections here would be to do it only for a limited period of time. The president has said he wants to see the DOGE work done by the 250th anniversary of the birth of the nation, by July 4th of 2026. So why not give the president the power to make some sweeping changes between now and that sesquicentennial? That's not easy for you to say, right? And so that we can actually get some of these things done. Otherwise, it won't be quite the impact. It won't have the impact that I think that Elon Musk and other people have been promising.
We're speaking with Richard Porter. He's a former lawyer from Chicago, former GOP committeeman from the state of Illinois, contributor to Real Clear Politics, has a piece on our site this morning called Cut the Strings, excuse me, and talking about this DOGE effort that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. One of the things they said, Richard, is that the DOGE itself would expire. They put a time limit on it. This is very much seen as an in the moment type of thing, a once in a generation or more effort that if it doesn't happen in the next year or two, it's probably never going to happen. And look, you've been in Washington, you've been part of administrations, you've watched this for a long time, as I have. The cynic in me is looking at this and thinking it sounds good, and you're right. There is a lot of energy and enthusiasm and support, quite frankly, across the political spectrum for this kind of stuff. At the same time, how realistic is it? I mean, the bureaucracy is so bloated, so entrenched, and manages to, go into circle the wagons to protection mode, that it's going to be really, really difficult. It seems like for anything substantial and lasting to get done here. That's just my impression. I don't know. Do you feel the same way, or do you have optimism that this might actually succeed?
Well, I think it could succeed, but I think that instinct of the bureaucrats to protect themselves is one of the protective devices that Congress can rely upon in giving the president a blank check. I mean, so one of the concerns, they say, well, gee whiz, I mean, giving the president that much power, what if he goes crazy with it? Well, the reality is there's so many constraints. It's not like there's a risk of the president doing too much. The much more likely result, as you've said, is he won't do enough, right? And so, going that extra mile to give him the power, recognizing that there are all sorts of institutional and informal constraints on the ability to make changes, that will still slow things down. But, so empowering the president legally doesn't mean that those constraints won't go away. It does mean you won't be in court. Maybe you won't get bogged down as much with lawsuits and slowed down that way. So, I think it's the only way we're actually going to make a real impact is giving more latitude, more freedom of action to the president, and recognizing that in a short period of time, with the expertise of Vivek and Elon, it's really unlikely that anything terrible is going to happen. To the contrary, this is the only way anything good might happen, is by giving them that kind of power.
On the other hand, Richard, the previous administration has set a precedent, and I'm thinking specifically about the student loan forgiveness program, which was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and yet didn't stop them from continuing to pursue that. I mean, yes, if they go at it through executive action, I'm sure it would end up in the courts, but there is precedent for Trump to just say, you know what, we're going to keep doing it anyway, which, I mean, I'm not sure that's great for the country. Could cause a constitutional crisis of some sort, but Biden didn't seem to, and the Democrats did not seem to care at all about that when they were in power.
Well, and it takes a long time to work its way through the courts. And, part of what happens is that starts changing the dynamic. If the court comes out with a strong opinion against some of these actions, that they're illegal actions, to press ahead in the face of that becomes, part of the story of what you're doing. You're acting in a manner that's illegal. I think that was one of the things that brought Joe Biden down, was the fact that he refused to recognize that his actions were beyond the scope of what the president could do. So, I mean, there's risk with following that path, and it just takes so much time. And I just feel like this is such a wonderful moment where the stars are aligned and the party is unified behind doing this. We're divided on so many other things. There's so much support for President Trump, and this is part of the magic that got him elected. Why not seize that and give him as much power as we can get through Congress? And there might be some limits on what you can actually do. I suggested a very sweeping blank check. It may well be, in order to get it through in the reconciliation process, which only requires 50 plus 1 votes in the Senate, you'd have to limit the scope of that blank check somewhat more than I've suggested. But, that's the sort of thing you could work on with the parliamentarian to get to a point where you've given the president as much power as possible to get this done without getting bogged down in court.
All right. Well, we'll see how your suggestion fares in the court of public opinion, and we'll see how this whole thing plays out. Richard Porter, former lawyer, contributor to Real Clear Politics. I urge everybody to go to Real Clear Politics and read the piece for yourself. And we appreciate you coming on, Richard.
Thanks, Tom. Have a great day.
All right. Going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. My next guest is James Piereson. He is the former president of the William E. Simon Foundation, and he's an occasional contributor to the new Criterion. So, Jim, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Andrew. Glad to be here.
So, Jim, I wanted to talk to you today because you have a fascinating piece in the new Criterion, which we link to on our front page today. It's about the National Endowment for Democracy, which may become a target for Donald Trump's new Department of Government Efficiency. It's a great piece because, at least to me, it does a couple of things. It describes why, in your view, the N.E.D. went off its rails and how it has become an entity that deserves to be defunded. But it also points out some of the reasons why it's going to be so hard to cut even what you think is a bad government program once it's been established. So with that as an introduction, what is the N.E.D. and what's gone wrong there?
Well, yes, it's a good question, Andrew. The N.E.D. is one of these small agencies in Washington that has managed to get its foot in the door going back to the 1980s when it was started. And it has beaten back many efforts to close it down. Like many operations, it's very hard to close anything in Washington for all the reasons we know. So the National Endowment for Democracy started in 1983. It was started as a Cold War operation.
Yeah, this was Reagan, right?
By President Reagan as part of the Cold War. And, Reagan was picking up on some ideas from JFK and from Jimmy Carter and from others that we needed to fight the Cold War on the plane of ideas, not just military, not just bombs and that sort of thing, but let's fight them on the plane of ideas, democracy versus communism. And that was the reason it started. Now, many people thought when the Cold War ended that it should be wound down. But like many things, it found a new mission and has continued for 30 years since the Cold War ended. Now, the N.E.D. is, however, a private charity. It's a private organization, has its own employees, own board of trustees. It operates on a $320 million appropriation each year from the Congress. And in that sense, it's a little bit like, say, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which gets a $500 million appropriation from Congress. So that is, I believe, more of a formal government agency.
Right.
But N.E.D. is private. Its employees are private. Board of Trustees governs the operation. It runs on taxpayer money. Its mission is to promote the idea of democracy around the world. And with that money, it supports a journal called the Journal of Democracy. It supports a media program, a free press program, and it makes about 2,000 small grants per year to organizations operating in foreign countries with the idea of promoting democracy.
Right.
I mean,
all sounds good to me. I mean, what's the problem?
A free press, labor unions, competitive elections, that sort of thing.
Right.
And that's what it's done over the years. Now, so what is the problem today
Right.
with the N.E.D. As it's morphed into its current form? Well, one of the issues is that it developed this idea of democracy according to which populist and nationalist movements are anti-democratic. So we understand what dictators are in Russia, Putin, and China, and Venezuela, and other places. But now they're claiming that movements that are supported by populist and nationalist groups are anti-democratic. So that would include, say, Orban in Hungary. Would include some of the movements that you see in Eastern Europe and Poland and in other places. And surprisingly, for many of the people at N.E.D., it includes Donald Trump as well. And that is now we're getting kind of to the core of the problem. So one issue would be that N.E.D. is funding programs in foreign countries, countries which are not necessarily adversaries in the United States.
Right.
Poland, for example, Hungary, for example, Saudi Arabia, for example. These aren't necessarily adversaries to the United States, but they're supporting pro-democratic programs there, which may destabilize the governments there, which are not necessarily the interest of the United States. The other point is that they've decided that Donald Trump somehow fits in to this problem of autocracies around the world fueled by nationalist and populist movements. So one of the major trustees of N.E.D. is a scholar by the name of Anne Applebaum. very distinguished scholar. Has
Right.
written about the Soviet Union, the concentration camps in the Soviet Union, and she has written a book called Autocracy. And it's an interesting book, a brief book, but basically she says that the autocrats are on the world, from Putin to Maduro in Venezuela, Chairman Z, they're all getting together to form their own alliance in opposition to the United States, and they're trying to overthrow governments around the world. And they believe that she believes that Donald Trump is sympathetic to this. Robert Kagan, another person who's been involved in this, has written a similar book on the same subject. Various writers and scholars at N.E.D. have written similar articles attacking Donald Trump as a fascist, a new version of Hitler or Stalin or Mussolini, along those lines. Indeed, Kamala Harris's campaign, in which she made this case, seems as if it was lifted from the N.E.D's playbook against Donald Trump. Now, the N.E.D. is not supposed to be involved in domestic issues. It's supposed to work abroad.
Right.
And the idea that they would now judge Donald Trump and the Republican Party as an anti-democratic force in the United States is extreme.
Yeah. So
And
I understand the sort of arc of the thinking. I can see how, as all entities in Washington, and this I think is one of the sort of underlying lessons of your article, is that these entities, once they're established, you can't kill them. It's very difficult. Why do you advocate cutting funding for it and not just reforming it, getting rid of some of the people you think shouldn't be on the board, getting a new president, doing that sort of thing?
Well, my article says that the new DOGE commission has the N.E.D. in its sights.
Yes.
Based on some of the conversations I had, is one of the things they're looking at. And I listed some of the things that has come to my attention, some of the things that they're looking at. So I don't think you reform these institutions in Washington. And I don't know how you do that. You'd have to clean out the staff and the board of trustees and start over again. So I don't know that that's possible to do. Now that DOGE is serious about cutting spending, this would seem to be an opportunity actually to step in here. Since it is a private organization, you don't have to phase it out or worry about the employees. They're not employees of the federal government. You can just cut off the appropriation, and you can tell N.E.D. to raise its funds from Bill Gates or George Soros or whomever.
Right. You just basically privatize it. It's no longer a
Yeah,
quango, as they call
they can
it.
continue on their mission, just not with taxpayer dollars.
Right.
One other very important thing is that they've now decided, like a lot of people in America, which is that, surprisingly and ironical in view of their mission, is that free speech and free debate on the internet and social platforms is a danger to democracy. We always thought that free expression worked hand in hand with the promotion of democracy, but they've now believed that misinformation is flooding the zone.
Right.
And misinformation is leading people to support autocrats around the world, including Donald Trump.
So they've awarded, and you write about this in your article, the $230,000 to the Global Disinformation Index, which is a group out of the UK that ranks websites, news organizations, including RealClearPolitics, by the way, on a sort of scale of how much they are disinformation or misinformation. And that is taking something that, was, again, something designed that was for overseas, and it has domestic implications for it. So they've sort of jumped the border on that one, at least.
Yes, well, as you say, RealClearPolitics is on this list.
Mm-hmm.
And so is the Federalist, and so is the American Spectator, and so is the Washington Examiner, where this article first appeared, and several other conservative publications. And as a consequence of being on this blacklist, Real Clear and others have lost advertising revenues.
Right.
I've spoken to some of these people. This has created a real hardship for them because corporations look at this list and they say, well, we can't advertise with these people. And therefore, they've taken a hit. So they have joined the misinformation campaign or disinformation campaign that's going on in America and somewhat around the world. which I see, maybe others do as well, as a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson said the answer to a bad argument is a better argument.
Right.
The answer to error is to point out the truth, not to shut down voices that disagree with you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, in N.E.D's defense, they have canceled that grant. They're no longer supporting that, but a lot of damage has been done in the meantime. And a committee in the Congress, the House Judiciary Committee, has written a report on this, which I cite in my article, where the committee says that the federal government has been laundering its censorship activities through grants to private organizations like this one. And they've asked the N.E.D, why are you involved in this? And they've somewhat been apologetic and have dropped that grant. But it is consistent with some of the other things they've been doing.
Yeah. Well, Jim, we're going to have to leave it there. I've been talking to Jim Piereson. It's a fascinating article in the New Criterion. You can find it on RealClearPolitics as well. It's about the National Endowment for Democracy. And Jim, we're going to check back with you on this story and see how it unfolds, because, as I said, it's really a story of how things are hard to kill in Washington, D.C., especially, we didn't even get into this. I want to get into it next time, when the media is involved. Anyway, Absolutely. You're listening to Real Clear Politics. I'm Andrew Walworth. We'll be back next Monday. We'll see you then. Bye.